Hello there. Welcome to the Saroy channel, wherever you are in the world, and I do hope you're doing remarkably well. Loads of love to each and every one of you, wherever you are in this world, and it's extraordinary how spread out we are, all geographically. North America, Canada, Africa, all kinds of places, and it's so exciting to be able to get together like this and have this interaction. So before we get started with the story, don't forget to get yourself that quintessential perfect drink, and whatever it is, let me know about it, especially if it is rather on the unusual side. And then let's get together and listen to a lovely story, and let's get started with tonight's story. Dear Sarah, and all your lovely listeners, it was a velvety black night, made significantly brighter by an almost full luminescent moon, along with a scattering of silvery stars that glittered, sparkled, twinkled like tiny gems in the vast sprawling canopy above our heads, while the cheerful music of the night filled our ears, from the chirps of the crickets, the croaks of the frogs, the occasional hoot of an owl. In the far distance, the howls of a lone wolf or coyote could be heard from a long way away, while the mysterious ethereal sounds of the night would leave you wondering, second-guessing, what was that? It was like the night enveloped me in a cosy, snug, reassuring blanket, filling me with those quintessential, cosy, nostalgic, wholesome feelings of being one with the natural world. To make matters even better, we were sitting around a fireside on timber logs that were over 100 years old, that had been designed into really cool-looking chairs by the skilled sculptural hands of my grandfather, a masterful carpenter or artist, but certainly not by profession. You could say it was more like a lifelong hobby for him. He could miraculously turn a piece of timber into an absolute masterpiece, and many items of his work were sold in contemporary art galleries across America, and were highly sought after by people with eclectic, avant-garde, innovative tastes who appreciated bringing the outside in. The fire crackled, spittered, spluttered, hissed and sizzled, the wooden pieces of timber glowing a vibrant orangey red, as the rambunctious flames danced exuberantly in the fire, while the aromatic wood smoke permeated the air with a pleasing bouquet that reminded me so much of barbecue chicken and sticky spare ribs cooking on burning hot coals. On this provocatively romantic but mellow, enchanting evening, all eyes remained fixed on the flames, as if locked in a hypnotic trance. The gentle, cool breeze blew against the flames, energizing their efficiency, so that the fire swayed and swaggered like an inebriated drunk, as the flames that engulfed the dried timber became ever brighter, taller, higher, wider, against the feisty wind, which, even though on the rather gentle side, had certainly hastened and dragooned its furious burn. At the end of my long fork, my white marshmallow began to caramelize. I pulled it away, removing the squishy, softened candy from the end of the fork, popping it into my mouth. It sizzled on the end of my tongue, melting like butter, infusing my appreciative taste buds with its sweet taste of burnt caramel. I reached for another marshmallow. This was addictive. I had greedily already eaten over a dozen, but then who was counting? If my busybody mother had been around, she'd have given me a firm slap on the wrist and told me to stop being so gluttonous. I could hear her scolding voice right now, droning in my head like a frenzied bee. "If you eat so much sugar, Russell, you'll end up like your Uncle Joe. Now, we wouldn't want that to happen to you, would we?" she would say to me in a condescending voice. My Uncle Joe was terribly fat. Much like a lovable walrus on a sandy beach, he struggled to manoeuvre his voluptuously expansive blubbery girth around our house, getting precariously caught up in doors and toilet cubicles on which his body often became unstuck. My mother had little sympathy for her brother, but now that he was under her strict thumb, as he'd moved in with us against his wise judgment, he was dropping weight faster than water, so no one would need extremes like bariatric surgery under my mother's watch, as she would literally glare at you with furiously offended eyes if you dared even consider a second helping of dessert. Heaven help you if you challenged her in this regard. My mother was a woman of extremes, taking things beyond the reasonable. She'd even put a lock on our refrigerator to prevent Uncle Joe from succumbing to temptation. I felt very sorry for him, as now that he was living with us under his doctor's advice, His days of sneaking trips to Wendy's, Burger King, McDonald's, Taco Bell and Subway were well and truly over. He looked so miserable, poor man. "If you don't nip your sweet tooth in the bud, Russell," my mother would say to me, "you'll end up just like him." I hardly think so, I would say. Uncle Joe ate enough food to sink the Titanic. Besides, he doesn't even have a sweet tooth. He's addicted to burgers and pizza. We were in the open yard outside my grandfather's rustic Montana farmhouse, where he had sold off most of the surrounding property to an affluent farmer, with a crop rotation system of wheat, corn and soya beans, as he'd reached his retirement years, so managing a huge farm would be all-consuming for him. Needless to say, he was very fortunate to be able to keep the illustrious 3-story white colonial farmhouse, painstakingly built from brick and wood, with its minimalistic rectangular shape that had graced our family line for many generations. My grandfather kept a small manageable piece of land that surrounded the farmhouse just for himself, with a stable block, a barn and an open garage to store his multiple farming gadgets, along with his old-world knickknacks that he couldn't bring himself to sell, as over the years he'd grown attached to some of them. They may have been obsolete, and many of them looked so retrograde and archaic, as if they belonged more in an agricultural museum, like an old plough made from wood with metal bolts, an ancient relic from the 1800s, I was told. A vintage classic horse-drawn machine to an ancient thresher that had snorted up vast spirals of black smoke in the Montana fields to bring about better harvests in those bygone days that were possibly used by long-since deceased members of the Murray family. My grandfather Hamish was equally as much a part of this land as the flowering meadows that surrounded it, the lodgepole pines, larches, hemlocks and ponderosas that flanked the land on the right-hand side of the valley. He was now in his early 80s, sporting a full head of windswept white hair, along with a stylish Van Dyke beard, which he manicured regularly to perfection like an old garden hedge, keeping it in tip-top, immaculate, pristine condition. He possessed these piercing blue eyes that sparkled with merriment and humour, eyes that had seen so much in his 85 years of life, from the early introduction of television to the sweeping technologies of cell phones and tablets, something that my Gramps could never ever get his head around. "I don't understand all this technology," he would complain. "I mean, I ask you, what on earth is wrong with a simple household telephone and television set? It's beyond me why people need all these fancy high-tech gadgets these days. If you ask me, the world has become far too complicated and a lot less happy with it. What is wrong with simplicity? It does make life so much easier." My mother told me that when he was a young man he was the town heartthrob. He was tall, dark and handsome in those days, but always charismatic, and this endearing quality had not changed over the years. It was his dry sense of humour, quick wit and teasing manner that had gladdened the heart of many a fair maiden back in his day. We loved coming to stay with my grandfather, all 3 of us, which included my sister Candace, who was 8, my brother Gus, who was 10, and me, of course. I was the oldest at 12. Sadly, my grandmother had died long before we were born, so we had never known her, but by all accounts she had been an extraordinary woman, whom my grandfather described as irreplaceable. After her death, my grandfather had continued to run his farm seamlessly, but now he'd chosen to retire, simply refusing to be parted from the home that had belonged to his family for generations. To all intents and purposes, he was not about to sell off something that meant so much to him, something that was under his skin, in his bones, and in the very breath of his soul. As he had so eloquently put it to my mother, "I was born on this land. I played on it as a young boy. I worked and ploughed the soil as a young man. And when I wither and die like a wild flower in the field, I want to become one with this land." And that was final as far as he was concerned. If there were any displeased faint whispers, disgruntled rumblings, or distant murmured suggestions of retirement homes looming on the horizon, those innuendos and imputations were quickly quashed, as my grandfather wasn't having any of it, and quite rightly so. "Gramps," asked my sister Candace, "do you have a scary story to tell us? Please, I love scary stories." I'm not sure this was entirely true, as when Candace heard a scary story of any kind, She was always unable to get to sleep. My mother would awaken to her frantic, discomposed screams during the night, where she boldly informed my mother that the monster in the scary story was under the bed now and about to eat her up. In the end, she would spend the rest of the night in my parents' bed, simply refusing to return to her own bedroom. All eyes focused attentively on my grandfather, as he was an absolutely fabulous storyteller, having grown up in a generation where storytelling was an art form, as eager families impatiently gathered together around an open fire, with hearts thumping with excitement, eyes solicitously focused in a voracious expectation on the family elder, as stories, tales, fables, and legends from American folklore were revealed to a gripping, impassioned audience. So invariably my grandfather's stories overshadowed any of my mother's books that she read us, about an angry caterpillar or a very disgruntled snapping turtle, for they seemed insipid, dull, bland, wishy-washy by comparison. My grandfather's stories were colourful, and over the years he'd told us many, but the best part of his stories was that they were all true. My grandfather's face gleamed under the light of the dancing fire, while his cornflower blue eyes twinkled. He was hesitant for a moment, his face twitching awkwardly, his jaw tightening, as if he was struggling with the conundrum of whether to share a story with us or not. I knew at once he had a story to tell. I was determined he would share it with us, even if I had to drag it out of him myself. "Please, Gramps," I begged. "Please, please tell us your story." My grandfather reached for a cigar from the upper pocket of his blue plaid jacket. I watched him remove the cellophane packaging as he popped the cigar into the edge of his mouth, which he then lit. He took in a huge puff, blowing out some wispy smoke from his mouth, releasing a huge sigh, as the smoke infused the atmosphere with an aromatic smell. "Oh, that is good. Very good. You want a story? Very well, I will tell you a story, and a good one too. But I worry your mother won't be very happy with me for sharing this with you. I'm very worried, Candace, that you might find it rather scary. I'm worried you might get nightmares." "No, I won't. I'm bigger now, Gramps, much bigger than I was before, and I can even sleep with the light off," she boasted. "Very well," my Gramps reluctantly agreed. "I'll tell you a story. It's about something that happened to me and my brother on this ranch when we were about your age at the time. I was probably about 11. "It happened here?" I asked excitedly. "Here on your ranch?" "Not exactly," said my Gramps, using his cigar to gesture towards the woods. "It happened over there." He looked at us for a moment and became very still. "There are things out there, things living in those woods that you can't even begin to imagine. There was a time that I would make fun of people who believed in fairies and elves, ghosts and anomalous creatures. But now I'm not so sure. I have an open mind these days to anything that people may say that they've seen, based on what I saw that spring day, on what seems like 100 years ago now." I sat at the edge of my seat, feeling the excitement welling up in my chest. What was my grandfather going to tell me? This was a story I wanted to hear. My two younger siblings seemed equally as enthralled. The marshmallow roasting had lost its appeal, had stopped and subsided. So apart from the crackling fire, all was very still, as we hung on to our Gramps' words with bated breath. "It was early spring," said my grandfather. "A rarely fine time of year, after a very cold winter. Me and my brother Austin decided to go exploring in the woods. We always enjoyed playing in the woods. Something about the tall, statuesque trees, the indigenous animals, the pretty, beguiling creek. It always engaged our attention. We decided to build a really rough shelter for ourselves, using fallen pieces of timber. I suppose, even at that young, tender age, I had a propensity to make things. So we were industriously creating our own little secret shelter, a place where we could play card games together, Monopoly, read books, eat our lunch al fresco. We put our noses to the grindstone, as we sedulously built our shelter against a large tree, overlooking the pretty views of the creek, where you could hear the rushing sound of the water gurgling over the rocks. It was a peaceful, idyllic and tranquil spot. I'm not sure you know it, do you, boys? I nodded. The creek's amazing, Gramps. I get why you liked it so much. I wouldn't mind building a shelter there myself one day. My grandfather continued. All of a sudden, in the midst of our assiduous building project, if you like, I heard a low, deep, guttural growl. I thought I'd imagined it, but one brief, perfunctory glance at my brother, I knew he'd heard it too. We sagaciously glanced around us from left to right, but saw nothing, so we continued with our project in earnest. All at once, a loud crack of a tree branch above our heads forced us to crane our heads upwards into the tree line, where we found ourselves staring into the savage red eyes of a ferocious monster who was standing on the open branch, balancing there precariously, as if he was surfing an ocean wave at sea. The branch was struggling to support his weight, for this fellow was easily 300 pounds, and it was cracking. I was astonished. For a moment I doubted what I was actually seeing. It seemed so incongruous with our natural environment. But after a second glance, I knew this was no insidious trick of the light, but boy, did I wish it was. This thing, it was real. It continuously leered at us, with an expression upon its face of malignant malevolence, stretching back its lips to expose a full jaw of jagged canine teeth, while an invidious growl radiated from the back of its throat in a low, guttural rumble. This hideous thing was tall, willowy, powerfully strong, with a humanoid-shaped body, covered in long, sleek, dense black hair, clawed hands with talons on both hands and feet. The face on this creature was like a Rottweiler dog. Its skull was prelate and slender, with a light, thin framework resembling a triangle on equal sides with blunt angles that formed a short muzzle. I also discerned it had a long, wispy tail. But what the heck was it? I couldn't fathom, for it seemed half man and half wolf, or half man and half dog. In truth, I couldn't decide which. Everything about this hideous, grotesque creature's demeanour was misanthropic and hostile. I was so frightened that I actually wet myself. I could feel the water dribbling down my legs, and felt very embarrassed, but that was the last of my considerations. I just remember saying to myself, "Oh my God! Oh my God! What is that?" My heart began to thump in my chest so fast, while my breathing sharpened and intensified. I heard a screaming sound filtering through the forest, and I wondered who was making such a god-awful, ear-piercing commotion. And that was when I realised, to my astounding astonishment, that it was actually me. I was the one screaming at the top of my lungs, while my brother was whimpering like a cowering dog. Everything about this beast was heinously evil, guilefully duplicitous. There wasn't a doubt in my mind that this creature was exceedingly intelligent. I was unequivocally aware about one thing. It wanted blood. It wanted our blood. "Do you think it wanted to eat you, Gramps?" asked Candace. "It wanted to kill us, more based on its abhorrent loathing it possessed towards us, rather than having an easy meal. My knees at the time were buckling under my legs like a crotchety camping chair. This thing glared at us with blazing red, hostile eyes, making us astutely aware that we were both in real perilous danger. I could feel, taste, smell, sense danger with every fibre of my entire being. It was like warning sirens were screaming in my head, yelling at me to run and run for my life. The rumble in the back of its throat deepened, so that it seemed like in any second the creature would lash out and strike. I screamed at my brother. "Run!" I cried. "Run! Run!" I could hear the creature bounce off the branch of the tree, landing on the ground so gently, with a similar buoyancy and resilience to your household tabby. I was struggling to run. The terror consumed me, making my legs feel as though they were weighted down by concrete blocks. But I broke through those hindrances with a steely grit and determination that seemed to finally fire up my legs into motion. But the next thing I knew was this thing had seized me by my arm, prostrated me to the ground, where his body pounced upon me like a lion over a deer. He straddled me with his human-like legs and streamlined torso, launching down upon me with his weight, while he bit my neck. I could feel the sharp incisors tearing into my flesh. I remember thinking, so this is what it feels like for a deer when it's attacked by a mountain lion. It was so surreal, but I will tell you something that surprised me, is that it didn't hurt at the time. Afterwards, it was a very different matter, of course, as the bite became infected and inflamed, like a Komodo dragon bite. So I was on antibiotics for a long while, causing me no end of grief and a whole lot of pain. My Gramps pulled back his plaid shirt to show us a deep-pitted, sunken, jagged scar on the right-hand side of his neck. I could hardly believe it. "Is that it?" I gasped, running my hand, marvelling the scar. "Is that where he bit you?" My Gramps nodded. "It's a beauty, a real war wound." My grandfather chuckled. I was crying. No, please, someone help!" My brother was screaming, throwing rocks at the creature, which was exceedingly brave of him. He could have easily just hightailed it back to the house, saving his own skin. But my brother was a brave boy. His hazel eyes were filling with tears. He was begging the creature, "Please leave my brother alone! Leave my brother alone!" My brother threw anything he could get his hands on at the creature, from driftwood to stones, anything. The humanoid dog was growling at him warningly, so much so that it nearly left me in order to chase after my poor brother. I was certain I was about to die, but I put up a big fight, oscillating my arms and legs, trying desperately to wiggle my way out of his firm, powerful clutches. But alas, I was completely submersed under his weight, as I was about 70 pounds at the time, and he was easily 300 pounds or more. All of a sudden I could hear this huge roar, accompanied by the chaotic, earth-shattering sound of thunderous feet pounding across the forest floor as everything vibrated and boomed, while branches snapped and cracked. In a trice, the monster that had attacked me was being pulled off my body, like a rose beetle from a rose, by something a hell of a lot bigger than he was. But what? That was the question. What? And that was when I saw her. Nothing in my wildest dreams prepared me for what I was seeing. This thing, which I now know to be a Bigfoot, was covered in long, flowing white hair. She was absolutely enormous. This dog-like humanoid didn't stand a chance against her. I scrambled hastily to my feet, but I couldn't run away. I was mesmerized, transfixed by the sight of these two powerful creatures engaging in a fight. It was an aggressive altercation, a warmongering fight, like watching two pugnacious pit bull terriers tearing into each other's flesh, fighting to the death. Only a hell of a lot more fearsome than that, for this dog-like humanoid put up an assaultive fight against the white-haired Bigfoot, which made a pit bull attack seem positively like a walk in the park or a cool breeze. I remember his powerful razor-sharp claws were lashing out fiercely at her, but they kept getting tangled up in her long hair. He kept making snapping noises with his mouth as he tried to get his teeth into her flesh, but her hair was always in the way. He was getting mouthfuls of it. This white Bigfoot held him down to the ground with an overlong arm, straddling him down with her hefty legs, sitting directly on top of him, crushing him under her sizable weight, as I could hear him groaning in agony. But I didn't feel an ounce of pity for this fractious beast, not an ounce. She glanced up at me, pointed to a stone, which was very heavy, but I managed to pick it up and brought it over to her side, feeling reasonably confident and assured that she was going to kill this nasty thing for us. I was not disappointed, or rather, me and my brother Austin were not disappointed. With her overlong arm using brute force, she bludgeoned his head as if pounding lemongrass with a pestle and mortar. I heard a moan, "Oh!" and then there was nothing but silence. Beautiful, beautiful silence. But the Bigfoot continued to hammer, crush, wallop away at the head of this humanoid dog, long after it was dead. I could see she was furious with it, as if she was acquainted with the likes of him, and despised him to her very core. I noticed there was nothing left of the obliterated skull, but just a pulverized mush of dark brown fur, brain matter, blood and goo. A grisly sight indeed, and not for sensitive eyes, I can assure you of that. The white Bigfoot studied us through her kind, deep-set dark eyes, and we were very struck by how human she appeared. Her face looked like a woman, weathered by the elements. Her brow was heavily furrowed with wrinkles. Her deep skin was almost a leathery salmon pink colour. I would say she was about 9 foot tall, 3 foot wide across the shoulders, possibly 900 pounds. Solid, burly, as heavy as a piece of farming machinery, covered with hair similar in colour to a polar bear. Actually, it really was quite beautiful. It gave her a ghostly, ethereal quality. It was long and flowing, but much more like human hair, and quite dense except on her knees, on her palms, and on her breasts. She glanced up at us. It was as if she was saying, "Are you all right?" My brother got the very same impression that this is indeed what she was saying. I was definitely struck by her intelligence and her genuine compassion. I'm in no doubt that she was watching over us with a mother's protective instinct. We both said, "Thank you, thank you." I'm certain she sensed our gratitude. She nodded, grabbed the strange dog-like humanoid, thrust his limp body over her shoulders like a huge sack of potatoes, and was gone from our sight. But when she moved away, it was like she floated on air. She was so graceful. For weeks, me and my brother were terrified to go back into the woods, in case we should encounter one of those hideous dog-like humanoids again. As if we'd seen one, maybe there were more. In the end, it was Austin that made me see sense. He said if the white hairy lady was still out there, then we could always be safe when we were in the woods, because she would have our backs, and nothing would be able to defeat her in a fight or an attack of any kind. It seemed he was right, as we resumed our play in the woods, having no trouble at all. We even got the impression we were being watched, but we sensed it was the white lady, making absolutely sure we were both safe. "What did your mother say about the bites on your neck?" "Well, she was mortified naturally, but when we told both our parents our far-fetched story, they found it too incredulous to actually believe. I heard my mother whispering to my dad, 'I think they've encountered a bear.' Our story seemed too nonsensical to even fathom, so I guess they just didn't buy it. Yet it was very clear that I'd been bitten by something quite substantial, with a very filthy mouth, based on the level of infection I acquired." "Did you ever see the white Bigfoot again?" "As it happens, we did. It would seem one of the farmhands had lit a cigarette, failed to stub it out, which on a farm is not the wisest thing to do, as anyone would tell you. My grandfather was always warning him about it. If you continue not to stub out your cigarettes after you've smoked, you could set my farm alight. It's a very dangerous habit," he warned the man, who was indifferent to my grandfather's complaints. I remember one night when I was lying fast asleep in bed. I awoke with a start to hear our house was being heavily pelted, not by rain, but with showers of inoffensive stones. My father was grumbling, "What the heck is that?" as he climbed out of his bed. We were all looking out of the window to see who it was that was throwing stones at our house, but it was dark outside, difficult to see anything. I leaned out of my window, and that was when I saw a flash of white. It was the white Bigfoot. She pointed to me and towards the horse stables, and that was when I saw the fire rising up in the distance and smelt the billowing black smoke. I shouted, "Mum! Mum! Dad! Dad! The stables are on fire! The stables are on fire! The horses! The horses!" I could hear my father mumbling angrily under his breath, "Bloody hell! I knew that man would set fire to those stables some day, and he's gone and done it." We all dashed out of the house towards the stables, fearing the very worst. We were certain the horses could not have survived that fire. We were filled with nauseous feelings of impending dread. I remember we stood around the stables, watching the roaring flames whizzing into the air. No one said a single word. It was very quiet, as tears filled our eyes. We knew that 15 of our horses were almost certainly dead. The entire stable block was engulfed in flames. My mother was sobbing because her favourite beloved horse, Brigadier, was caught up in the inferno. I remember she collapsed on the ground in a kneeling position, pounding the grass with her fists. She was howling, my baby, Brigadier! Oh, my Brigadier! Oh, my Brigadier, he's gone!" My father went to call the fire brigade, while me and my brother sobbed inconsolably, for we loved the horses very much. Then in a distant meadow we heard the whinnies of our horses and ran over to the meadow, and all 15 of them were there. Granted, they were shaken, but no worse for wear. That was when I realised that the white Bigfoot had rescued all those horses, saved their lives from the stable, probably broken down the door before it became engulfed in this inferno. She was the one that alerted us to the fire. Of course, I never told my parents about the white Bigfoot, but I told my brother, as he, I knew, would believe me. My brother said, "Didn't I tell you she's looking out for us?" We chose to call the Bigfoot Moon Dancer, because she was the colour of the moon, and when she ran, she looked like she was floating on air. She was so graceful. "Wow! That's an incredible story, Gramps. Do you think she might still be around today?" My Gramps shrugged. "I hope so, but she would be very old now, no doubt about it. She was a magnificent creature who saved all those horses, put a stop to a dreadful fire that could have got seriously out of hand, and possibly even burnt down the farmhouse. Suffice to say, my father sacked the farmhand the following day. "You nearly killed my horses! I want you off my land right now, and if I don't see you ever again, it'll be too soon." "I'm sorry, sir," he'd said. "Give me a second chance. I won't ever smoke again, I promise. I'll put all my stubs out from now on." "I can't trust you. 15 of my horses nearly died last night because of your apathetic, nonchalant attitude." It was then that my father rightly began to ponder as to how the horses managed to escape that dreadful inferno. How had they got out of the stable? And who had pelted our home with stones to alert us to the dangers of the fire? That was something that rarely bothered him for a long time. It was a huge conundrum for him. My mother, being very religious, believed God had sent an angel to save the horses, which I suppose you could say he did, in a manner of speaking. "So your parents never did see the white Bigfoot, then?" "Well, no, not on that occasion," said my Gramps, taking another puff of his pipe. But my mother did see her once," he said, a huge smile bursting onto his face. "My mother had taken our poodle out to do its business in the middle of the night. The next thing we knew, my mother let out this most god-awful scream that vibrated through the entire house like an ear-piercing ambulance siren. Everyone dashed down the stairs, thinking that something quite terrible had happened. My mother continued to scream, even when she was in the kitchen. She just wouldn't stop. She was like a trilling, annoying alarm clock that you could never switch off unless you broke it. So my father slapped her across the face, something he'd never done before or since, but he had to stop her from screaming. "What the heck is wrong, Sonia?" My mother stopped screaming, but her eyes grew wide and she began to tremble. I've seen a ghost! I've just seen a ghost!" "What?" "I told you! I've seen a ghost!" At this, my father looked confounded. "Where did you see this ghost?" My mother trembled, her whole body wobbling like a jelly. I was taking Pixie for her pee. Then I saw it floating across the lawn. It was big, hairy. It looked directly at me. The ghost, it looked at me," she said, her eyes growing ever rounder. And then it floated into the woods. It was the scariest thing I've ever seen in my life." "You poor thing," said my father, cradling my mother in his arms. "You've had a nasty shock." Of course, me and my brother burst out laughing, as we realised my mother had seen Moondancer. Of course, our sniggers went down with my parents like a lead balloon. "You boys should be ashamed of yourself," said my father, "laughing at your mother like this, when she's had the fright of her life." "But Dad, she didn't see a ghost," I protested. "How dare you, son? Such insolence! You disappoint me. If your mother says she saw a ghost, she saw a ghost. Do you hear me?" But Dad..." "No buts, son. You and your brother. Your insolence, I've had enough. You go to bed right now. Do you hear me?" We dutifully obeyed. My mother went to her grave believing she'd seen a ghost. I promise you there wasn't a dinner party that she didn't host where she did not reveal her strange encounter with a white hairy ghost. All her guests were delighted in hearing her account again and again and again. That became exceedingly exaggerated over the years. To cut a long story short, me and my brother were blown away by the story my grandfather shared with us. But of course, as we expected, Candace was beginning to have nightmares at night as a result of my grandfather's story. So my mother came down on him like a ton of bricks. "What are you doing, filling my children's heads with outlandish stories? Candace can't get to sleep at night because of you. I hope you're happy with yourself, Dad. Do you have no understanding of children? Why can't you read them decent books that are safe, like The Angry Caterpillar or The Snapping Turtle? That's what a kid wants to hear. Not monstrous human dogs galloping through woods attacking children." My mother was wrong about that, because the story my grandfather told me was the most incredible story I've ever heard. So there you are. That's my story. Wow, what an incredible story. Until next time, goodbye and good night.